Okay, this is lecture number 8 for Wednesday, May 6th for History 321, the French Revolution at Northland College in May of 2020. Today we're going to start the revolution, and we're going to do that by looking at the financial crisis that led the King of France to call the Estates General, and then we're going to look at the events in that first month or two of the Estates General that turned it into the National Assembly, and then started the actual process of revolution. And I want to point out something here that Lefebvre, in his in the section that you read from Lefebvre, The Coming of the French Revolution, he talked about 4 revolutions in succession. The first one he called the aristocratic revolution, and that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about here with the Assembly of Notables and the Parlement. And this was basically the aristocracy saying they refused to help the French king out of the financial crisis. And then the second, the bourgeois revolution, happens when the National Assembly declares itself. And then Lefebvre says the third is when the urban poor in Paris, the working class in Paris, get involved with the storming of the Bastille. And then the fourth is when the peasants get involved with the Great Fear, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. So I want you to keep in mind that Lefebvre sees these events as 4 distinct things because 4 distinct social classes are getting involved in the events. We'll see that Furet says is something entirely different is going on. Furet basically says that all of this leads to the collapse of the government, and once there is that, the government has collapsed, essentially doesn't know what to do, there's a vacuum, and the ideas of Rousseau sort of step in. And of course, Tackett would say that each of these events is a small sequence of decisions by individual people, which set the terms for the next set of decisions, which set the terms for the next set of decisions. And so each decision carves out a path that causes the next decision and the next decision, etc. So I want to talk about first the financial crisis. After the American Revolution, France had helped the Americans out enormously by sending a huge naval force to blockade New York Harbor so the British couldn't move around their armies very well. And then it had sent a huge land force to help George Washington, and the French and the Americans together had cornered the British General Cornwallis at Yorktown and forced him to surrender. And so really, without the French assistance, the Americans would almost certainly not have won the revolution, won their independence when they did. They might have still done it, but it might have taken 10 more years. So with French intervention, the United States declares independence, and the United States starts on its own path as an independent country. But for France, the French Revolution really was, the American Revolution was really the last straw financially because France really couldn't afford it. And the finance minister during this time period was a guy named Jacques Necker. And Necker was interesting. He was actually a French Protestant. And he was considered to be a financial wizard. And Necker basically, at this point, the French government's finances were not public. No, the French government never published a budget. It never talked about how much money it took in. It never talked about what it spent money on. It was considered to be the king's private business. But Necker had actually decided to release a budget of his own free will, but the numbers were all cooked. Right? And it made Necker look really good, like he was just a brilliant guy managing all these problems. But it was all fake numbers, and essentially he was covering up how much money he had to borrow, and he borrowed enormous amounts of money for the American Revolution. But as far as political observers or anybody in France who was sort of paying attention, they saw Necker's published numbers and they thought, oh, the French government didn't go far into debt at all. This is great, wonderful. But by the mid-1780s, Necker and then there's other finance ministers, and Necker gets brought back. But the finance ministers of France are realizing that they really are just flat out broke. I mentioned last time that by 1788, the French government's budget, which was not really published, had 49% of the budget, basically half of the budget, was set aside to pay interest on the debt. Not to pay off the debt, but just pay the interest on the debt. And then another 25% of the French budget was for paying the military. So 74%, three-fourths of the French budget, was just paying interest on the debt and paying the military. And that did not include paying for the king's household. It did not include paying for roads and bridges and things like that. It did not include, government inspectors or censorship office or anything like that. So a huge portion of the French government was just, French revenue was simply going to interest on the debt and the military. So all of this comes to a head finally in 1787. And the king's, the real problem here is that the king had tried at various points to push through laws that would allow him to tax the aristocracy and the clergy because that's where the money was. But the aristocracy and the clergy had ways of blocking it. In particular, as I mentioned, there's this system of parlement, which were regional courts. And for a law to become law, it had to be written into the books by those regional courts. They had to register the law in their big book of laws. And the noble parliament simply refused to do that if the law raised taxes on the aristocracy. And so the king was finding that he could write all the laws he wanted to, but he couldn't get them enacted. Well, he finally decides that the way to handle this, he has a chief minister, not the finance minister, but a chief minister named Calonne. And Calonne decides that the way to do this, what he's going to do is call an assembly of notables. He's going to hand select about 100 really wealthy, important individuals. Some of them are going to be bourgeois, but most of them are going to be aristocrats and clergy leaders, bishops and archbishops and high-ranking nobles with a lot of money, les grands. And he's going to bring about 100 of them together. He's going to call this the Assembly of Notables. And he's going to open up the French government's books, and he's going to say to them, look, this is how bad the situation is. We need to fix this. And then the hope was that these notables would see this and say, oh my gosh, you're right, we really do need to do something, we do need to tax ourselves, and then they would go back and convince, make a public statement saying we think it's necessary for taxes on the aristocracy of the church, and convince everybody to go along with it. So Calonne brings in the Assembly of Notables in February of 1787, and he opens up the books and he shows them the books. And the notables look at the books and they say, wow, this is really bad. The French government's finances are horrid. And then, in a thing that was shocking to Calonne, they said, this can't be right. I'm like, what do you mean? Well, Necker published the books, a few years ago, and it wasn't nearly as bad. And Calonne's like, no, but this is the situation now. This is really what the numbers are. And they said, no, we don't believe you're that incompetent. And Calonne's like, what do you mean? He said, well, nobody could screw up this badly and go that far into debt in that short amount of time. There's no way you're that incompetent. And Calonne's like, no, really, we are that incompetent. We really did screw this up this badly. I'm like, no, we don't believe it. And so instead of agreeing to new taxes, the Assembly of Notables goes to the king, Louis XVI, and says, we think you should fire Calonne because he's just colossally incompetent. And so they fire Calonne, and they bring in the king hires a new chief minister, and it was one of the guys from the Assembly of Notables who had been the most critical of Calonne, a guy named Loménie de Brienne, who was a bishop, an archbishop actually. And Loménie de Brienne goes back to the Assembly of Notables and says, you know what, I've looked at the books and they're actually this bad. So here's the situation, we still need to raise money. And the Assembly of Notables basically says no. And so in May of 1787, the king disbands the Assembly of Notables. Well, then the king decides, okay, what do I do now? And so he decides on a sort of a radical plan. What he does is he decides he's going to force the Parlement to accept laws raising taxes on the aristocracy. And he tries to push through a series of laws through the Parlement, and if the members of the Parlement don't register the laws, he exiles them to some tiny little podunk small town, says, you have to live there, and as long as you don't register my laws. And he's basically hoping to force the members of the Parlement, because they hate living in some tiny little small town, to ratify the laws. Well, basically, this leads throughout 1788 to a whole series of standoffs between the king and various parliament, and it leads to riots. The parliament could actually organize riots and things, and the parliament here they're all nobles, and they're all resisting taxes on the nobility, but they present themselves to the public. They write pamphlets and things saying to the public, hey, we're here trying to prevent the government from increasing taxes on everybody, and we're here to try to prevent the government the king is trying to be a tyrant and push through taxes, but we, your loyal representatives in the parliament, are preventing him. So they position themselves as sort of standing up for the nation against the king, and his desire to just unilaterally increase taxes. And a lot of people kind of buy this. They see the Parlement as resisting tyranny, right? Now, this is a big part of what Lefebvre is talking about as the sort of aristocratic revolution, that the aristocracy is leading this sort of revolt against the king trying to increase taxes, right? We'll also see when we get to Baker towards the end of the semester, we'll see that this revolt by the aristocracy against the monarchy, they developed what post-structuralists would call a discourse, a set of terms and a sort of set of ideas that logically support their position. And when you hear people talking about those terms and ideas, you know they're sort of tapping into this set of ideas coming out of this revolt movement. But we'll get into that later. But just keep this in mind for in a couple weeks when we read the Baker. So essentially, Louis tries throughout the first half of 1788 to force the Parlement to register new laws raising taxes on the aristocracy and the church, and the Parlement resists successfully. And so finally, in August, the king announces that he's going to call an Estates General. And the Estates General was a sort of a French parliament. It was actually made up of 3 distinct estates, which is why it's called the Estates General. And so the Estates General is generally, the 3 estates are, the first estate is the clergy. So, and I want to point out that the Estates General had been first called, I think, in the 1300s, and it had last been called in France in like the 1610 or 1620. And so, let me get the date right on that. 1614. There you go. So the Estates General had last been called in 1614, which is like 170 years earlier. But at that time, the Estates General consisted of basically 200 representatives elected by the clergy, and then about 200 representatives elected by the aristocracy, and about 200 representatives elected by the commoners, who was everybody who wasn't clergy or aristocracy. And so the Estates General had initially been a device that medieval kings of France had used to try to get people to approve new taxes, right? The idea was that you could get all these representatives, sort of opinion makers, in one room and sort of convince them of the necessity of taxes, get them to go along with it, and then they could go and convince their constituencies, the church, the aristocracy, etc. So this is kind of a long shot on Louis. He's really reaching into his bag of tricks and getting to the bottom here, because this is something that nobody tried in 175 years, and there's no guarantee it's going to work. But nonetheless, he announces that they're going to have elections in late 1788 and the Estates General and early 1789, and that the Estates General will meet in May of 1789. All right. Now, at this point, it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions, because a number of people say, well, look, the last time the Estates General met, there were 200 clergy, 200 aristocrats, and 200 commoners. But the commoners are way more of the population than the clergy and the aristocrats. And so a number of people began to say, well, why do those numbers have to exist? In addition, the Estates General had this interesting rule that they didn't vote by head. Each individual representative didn't have a vote. Instead, they voted by order. So the 200 representatives of the clergy got 1 vote for the clergy, and the 200 representatives for the aristocracy got 1 vote, and the 200 members of the commoners got 1 vote. And so essentially on any vote the Estates General took, there were 3 votes cast, right? And so it was either going to be unanimous or it was going to be a 2-to-1 vote, right? Now, remember what I said before about how the upper reaches of the clergy, the archbishops and bishops in France, were often the younger brothers of the aristocracy, right? That the younger brothers of the aristocracy didn't inherit noble titles, so the family often set them up by buying a bishopric or an archbishopric for them. And so lots of people looked at this and like, oh, well, if the clergy and the aristocracy get 2 votes, then, and again, they represent 1.5% of the population. So if 1.5% of the population gets 2 votes, and they're all going to vote the same because they're basically brothers with each other, all related, and then 98% of the 98.5% of the population gets one vote, this doesn't seem fair. So a lot of people began questioning how the Estates General was going to be set up. But on September 23rd, 1788, the Parliament of Paris issues a ruling that they say the only legal way to have the Estates General is to do it according to the rules of 1614. And people just go nuts. This is crazy. They don't want this. To the aristocracy, this seems totally right because you're doing it according to tradition, which is always how the Estates General have been done. And so that's traditional. But for a lot of people in France, there'd been enough circulation of Enlightenment ideas. They had just seen the American Revolution, and this idea of sort of fairness and democracy and representative government and government coming from the people seemed to imply that this setup for the Estates General was just unfair, right? Why should 1.5% of the population get 2/3 of the votes? And so a lot of people began to say, no, we need to change the Estates General, and in particular. A number of people began to petition the government demanding two things. The first is you double the number of representatives in the third estate. So then it would be 200 clergy, 200 aristocrats, and 400 commoners. Now in the actual event, they actually come up with about, it turns out to be about 300, 600. But and then the second thing they demand is that you vote by head rather than by order. So instead of all the clergy having one vote, every representative of the clergy has one vote. And so there's, if there's 200 clergy, they have 200 votes. If there's 200 aristocrats, they have 200 votes. If there's 400 commoners, they have 400 votes, right? So if you take those two things together, doubling the third and voting by head, it would give the commoners, who's still 98.5% of the population, roughly 50% of the clout. And the hope is that there would be some members of the aristocracy and clergy who would be willing to be swayed by Enlightenment ideas and fairness and whatever and vote with the commoners. All right? Well, the economic situation in France is going to hell in a handbasket while this is happening. I just want to mention this in passing. There have been a number of things going on in France that were making the economic situation really bad by 1788. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but first of all, the population of France had been rising for quite some time, since the 1730s, and it had reached 26 million, which was really about the maximum amount of people that France could feed. And because of that, food prices have been rising dramatically in the previous couple of years. In addition, Enlightenment, there have been several ministers for the king who had been Enlightenment thinkers who thought that the best way to get bread prices under control was to let the market float. Before that, the French government had always set bread prices so that the bread wouldn't cost too much. But now they said, no, if you need market efficiency, we've got to let bread prices float. So bread prices were actually going up quite significantly because these guys didn't know it, but the law of supply and demand, there was a shortage of supply and a high demand, which means the prices are going to go up, right? That's how the market works. In addition, France had signed a trade agreement with England recently, which did two things that were really bad for France. Number one, England had a population that was high enough they needed to import grain, and England began importing grain from France, which meant in France there were even more shortages and the price goes even higher. And second, England had by this time started the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and England was beginning to export textiles. And England was beginning to dump textiles into France because of this trade agreement. So this was causing economic distress for the textile industry in France because they were competing with England suddenly where they hadn't before. And it was causing grain prices to go up because England was outbidding France for its own grain, so to speak. Finally, there were a series of bad harvests and a freak hailstorm in France in 1788. There were a series of bad harvests in the late 1780s. And then in 1788, there was a freak hailstorm around Paris, and bread prices had gone even higher because it had been a bad harvest. It had destroyed the harvest, and everybody knew that the harvest that was going to come in the fall of 1788 was going to be bad because of this hailstorm in the spring of 1788. It wiped out a lot of the crops. And so, in all of this, France is sort of going through an economic crisis, right? And I mean, this is really getting bad. There are some estimates by historians that by some of the worst points in 1788, working class people in Paris were spending 90% of their income on bread, just bread. right? And when people are spending 90% of their income on bread, they are not buying anything else, right? And they're not even paying rent. And so this was causing a major economic depression. So in the middle of this sort of political crisis where the government's trying to figure out its finances, you have this economic crisis going on. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically the king fires Loménie de Brienne, his chief minister, and he brings in Necker. And he says, Necker, you're back. I want you to run things for me. And so Necker says, okay. And the first thing Necker has to do is make a decision on the Estates General. What's it going to be? And Necker makes the argument that he says, okay, we'll double the third. Great. We're going to have twice as many representatives for the commoners as the aristocrats and clergy. Super, but we're going to keep voting by order. Which means that now you'll have 200 clergymen who have one vote, 200 aristocrats who have one vote, and 400 commoners who have one vote. Right? So it really doesn't help the position of the commoners at all. But Necker presents this as a compromise. He's giving each side something, but it really it doesn't help the commoners at all. Well, one of the things going on right now is that you're actually seeing a whole lot of agitation. In particular, there's a group called the Committee of 30, and it's a group of roughly 30 really wealthy aristocrats and a couple of commoners who have been meeting as sort of salons, and they talk a lot about Enlightenment ideas and whatever, and they're really kind of taken with the American Revolution, and they're really kind of taken with the ideas of Rousseau and with Locke and with the idea of a social contract and representative government and a constitution and all that stuff. They really embrace Enlightenment ideals, and they start publishing pamphlets in late 1788. They start just paying with their own money to publish pamphlets. And the pamphlets, they're calling for the doubling of the third and voting by head. But even more so, they're calling for reform of the French government from top to bottom. They're calling for Enlightenment reforms. They're calling for a constitution. They're really starting to push some Enlightenment ideas. And in particular, there's one pamphlet by a guy named Abbé Sieyès. And this pamphlet, it's called What is the Third Estate? And it basically says, I'm not going to go into the details, but he basically says the aristocracy and the clergy own everything, but they don't produce anything. They don't work. They're just leeches sucking off the body of the body politic of France. And the commoners, 98% of the population, he actually says 96 in his pamphlet, but the commoners do all the work. They do everything productive in France, and they get nothing. And so he basically says, real France is the commoners, and the aristocracy and the clergy shouldn't have any say in the French government because they're a bunch of leeches. This is a pretty radical idea. This is quite the radical idea. And so essentially, throughout 1788, they have an election, or the late 1788, they start to hold elections. And the elections happen in multiple different ways in different regions, etc. But essentially, all the members of the clergy are supposed to vote to elect representatives for the Estates General. And there's a couple interesting things about that process. One is that there's lots of members of the clergy in France are monks in monasteries. But because monks in monasteries have taken a vow of obedience to the head of the monastery, each monastery actually gets only one vote. The head of the monastery votes for all of them. And so monks tend to not have, they're basically disenfranchised. They don't get much of a vote. But what's interesting is that in the past, elections to the Estates General had always favored all the big archbishops and cardinals and whatever, all the bigwigs in the church. But this time around, it doesn't quite go that way. There's actually been enough of a shift in the Enlightenment that a number of the clergy are not just automatically deferring to the heads of the church, they're actually voting for who they think would be a good representative. In addition, there's also the election for the aristocracy, right? And here again, it's interesting because in the past, you would always just vote for all the top, the grand, the dukes and the really wealthy marquises, etc. But there's a number of aristocrats who have embraced Enlightenment ideals, and they're actually sort of outspoken proponents of Enlightenment ideals. And some of them get elected, and some of them actually don't get elected, but they get elected by the commoners, which is kind of interesting. And then finally, they have the elections for the Third Estate, and these are interesting because they really are letting everybody vote. Everybody male. They are letting peasants vote, and they have this multiple layered process where everybody in one region will vote for, well, everyone in their town will vote for someone to be their representative from their town, and then all the representatives from the towns go to a regional meeting where those representatives all vote amongst themselves to pick one of their members to go to a departmental meeting, and then all the departmental representatives get together and they vote, and so there's like multiple layers of elections. But the way that works is that it tends to elect people who are good at public speaking, because at these meetings, especially at the regional and departmental level, the person who can get up and make the best case is generally the one who gets elected. But one interesting thing that happens here is that the king has also announced, or Necker has announced, that there's going to be a big notebook at each polling station. When somebody goes to vote for their representatives, they get to write down in the notebook what they want the Estates General to fix. These are called the Cahiers de Doléances, or the notebooks of grievances. And the Cahiers de Doléances are a fantastic thing for historians, because now they can see what was on people's minds. And what's kind of interesting is that most of the peasants are really just interested in seigneurial dues. They just want a seigneurial dues addressed. And a lot of people are just interested in heavy tax burdens. They're not really calling for a new government or a constitution or a republic or anything like that. There's not a whole lot of revolutionary sentiment represented in the Cahiers de Doléances. But nonetheless, the Cahiers de Doléances are there, and they give people the impression that the government really is listening to them and it wants what's good for what the people want. Right? Well, essentially, the Estates General is elected then. And the final elections are finalized in March of 1789. And in the end, because of all the negotiations, etc., you wind up getting about 300 clergymen, 300 aristocrats, and about 600 commoners. So roughly 1,200 members total in the Estates General. And they're according to the rules, they're kept very distinct. Clergy here, aristocracy here, and commoners here. And they're actually seen as three different assemblies. There's the assembly of the first estate, the assembly of the second estate, and the assembly of the third estate. Well, I want to talk just a little bit about the makeup of the Estates General, because it is kind of interesting demographically who shows up here, right? Because this is an important point. The Marxists are like, this is a bourgeois revolution now that happens in the Estates General. So who's actually there, right? Who is this bourgeoisie the Marxists are talking about? Well, what's interesting is, first of all, for the clergy, far fewer, almost no monastic, monks get elected. But what's interesting is that most of the actual representatives are actually parish clergy. They're actually not bishops and archbishops. There are several bishops and archbishops in this group, but they're not nearly as heavily represented as they used to be. The overwhelming number of the clergy are parish priests, and the parish priests actually wind up being far more open to revolution and radical change than the aristocratic bigwigs would have been. And so this group of clergy is less conservative than you might have expected. Right? Second, the aristocracy. The aristocracy were interesting. Wealthy Parisian nobles, the Grand, are overrepresented. They get a lot of election. But there's also a pretty big contingent of really poor nobles who are kind of aggrieved, and they really are desperate to protect their privileges because that's all they have. And so the nobles are kind of split between these sort of wealthy, the super wealthy, and the really poor nobles. And there's not a whole lot of the middle of the provincial nobility. They're there, but they don't dominate. Only about an eighth of the second estate is nobility of the robe. That's people who've gotten their titles recently. And lots of nobles who had gotten their titles recently were actually kicked out into the third by the voting process. So it's mostly traditional nobles who have had their titles in their family a long time, the ones who are really attached to their privileges, etc. The third estate was interesting because, as I mentioned, the process tended to favor people who could speak well. And what you wind up getting then is a whole bunch of lawyers. In the third estate, about half were actually lawyers, and about 2/3 had some legal training of some sort. And so lawyers are overwhelmingly represented in the third estate. Now, what's also interesting is that you really don't see much in the way of big merchants or manufacturers or anybody who sort of represents the really wealthy bourgeoisie. And this is an interesting point because the Marxists want to say that the revolution is led by this rising bourgeoisie who is commercial and they want to change the economy to create capitalism, etc. That's Marxist theory. But the actual people who are doing this, the third estate, they are bourgeois, but they're lawyers, right? They're not the manufacturers and the merchants. The manufacturers and the merchants are not represented there. They're really a tiny percentage. All right. And finally, there are virtually no peasants or artisans, right? So there's virtually nobody in the assembly who is a peasant or an artisan. You might ask also about the Estates General and the Enlightenment. There were about 10 members of the Estates General who were actually fairly well known as having published Enlightenment books or works. They were known as philosophes. They were known as being intellectuals. There were about 10. There were several dozen others who were sort of minor intellectuals. They weren't famous by any means, but they had published something, or they had written an article or two here or there, and so they were really not major figures. But there was nobody in the Estates General who was really a major intellectual of any sort. But there were some people like the Abbé Sieyès who were clearly engaged. And Abbé Sieyès gets elected for the Third Estate. They're clearly engaged with Enlightenment ideas, but the number of really powerhouse deputies is pretty small. And what's also interesting is I mentioned that Tim Tackett had written this book about the National Assembly and what they thought. A lot of them in their letters home were really comfortable using terms like reason and science and things like that. So they were sort of up on the Enlightenment ideas in general, but very few represented or mentioned Rousseau, and very few mentioned anything having to do with political theory. John Locke, social contract, Rousseau, general will, any of that. None of that terminology shows up. These guys are really kind of not big fans of political theory because they really just didn't talk about it. All right, so the Estates General come together on May 5th, 1789. And the first thing they're supposed to do is they are supposed to register all the names of all the people who are there so that they know who's actually there. And then they're supposed to do a roll call and say, okay, now we're ready to begin deliberations. So this is the formal opening. But what's interesting, and they meet at Versailles, which is 12 to 20 miles outside of Paris. Paris has grown over the years, and I'm not sure the exact distance at that time. But the thing that happens, which is kind of amazing, is that the Third Estate refuses to take roll call and sit. They basically say, we refuse to play this game. We refuse to be the Third Estate in the Estates General unless you change the rules. And they basically say, we want voting by head. Right? You double the third, there's twice as many of us, but we want voting by head before we're going to play your game. Right? Now, the clergy and the nobility, they go ahead and register. They're all set to go, but the Third Estate won't. And so it sort of stops. Even before it starts, because it can't start until the Third Estate takes roll, it stops. And they just sit there. And it's a standoff, and they start negotiating, and the king is like, no, you got to do this. If you just register, then we can talk. And they're like, no. This is our big piece of leverage. We're not registering until you guarantee us what we want. And so it turns into a standoff. Right? And the Third Estate starts to play some games then. They send a letter to the First and Second Estate saying, hey, why don't you come join us? Why don't we stop doing that? And then Abbé Sieyès is really kind of a rabble-rouser. He says, why don't we, as the Third Estate, vote to call ourselves something else? We'll call ourselves the Commons. Because that sounds like the House of Commons in England, in the Parliament. The lower house, right? There's the House of Lords in the English Parliament, and there's the House of Commons. Well, they call themselves the Commons, which is clearly saying, hey, we think of ourselves like the English Parliament. Well, that's a huge thing to say, because in the English system, Parliament is clearly dominant over the king at this point. They'd fought an entire civil war and executed a king to show that Parliament was dominant over the king. So to call themselves the Commons is to say, we are above the king in France, too. We are above Louis XVI. Well, Louis is not going to accept that. And on June 12th, the Commons decides that they're just going to start roll call, not as the Third Estate, but as the Commons, as an assembly of the whole nation. And so they start acting as if they're an assembled body that represents the nation. And Abbé Sieyès is really the lead sort of agitator here. And then Abbé Sieyès convinces them, once they've seated themselves as the Commons, they change their name again to the National Assembly. So what they're saying is that we represent the whole nation of France, right? Which implies that the aristocracy and the clergy are not part of the nation of France. Well, this is, given what Abbé Sieyès had written in What is the Third Estate, that's a pretty big statement, right? So, then the assembly does an interesting thing. Just to up the king is still like, no, I don't recognize you, you're not legal, you're not it. Well, then the National Assembly does something really fun. They basically say, we vote to abolish all taxes in France, and then we vote to reestablish them on a temporary basis that will expire and has to be renewed regularly by the National Assembly. So they basically just said, we have the right to levy taxes, not the king. We're in charge of taxes, and the king only gets taxes that we approve. Right? Now, there's nothing legal at all about this, but they said it, right? They did it. They're basically sending a shot across Louis XVI's bow saying, we're taking your powers, right? You've got these powers right now, but we're taking them. On June 19th, the First Estate, the clergy, takes a vote, and they decide to join the National Assembly. So now the First and Third Estates are together. The Second Estate, the aristocrats, is still holding out. They're like, no, we're not doing this, right? But even then, a few aristocrats trickled over to the Third Estate and said, or the National Assembly said, hey, can I join? Right? Well, finally, on the morning of June 20th, the National Assembly comes to the meeting hall, which is in Versailles, the King's Palace, and they find a note on the door is locked, and they find a note on the door, and it says, basically, all meetings are canceled. We're going to have a royal session instead. And a royal session was when the king would call members of his community together and he would lay down the law. A royal session is when the king makes it known what's going to happen. Right? A royal session is not about voting or discussing or negotiating. A royal session is about handing down the will of the king, and nobody can stand up to a royal session. So the king calls a royal session for June 23rd. Now, I should mention, the National Assembly, they come to the meeting hall, it's locked. There's a note, we're going to have a royal session. They realize that if they just wait until the royal session, they're basically giving the king back the sort of authority because he gets to call the royal session. So the National Assembly says, no. They look around and they realize this. The only place they could meet, remember there's at this point there's like 800 of them, 900 of them. They realize that the king has some tennis courts, indoor tennis courts, that have bleachers that could hold 900 people. So they go to take over the king's tennis court. And then on June 20th, they decide that they're going to take an oath. They take what's called the tennis court oath on June 20th. And the tennis court oath not only says, we are the National Assembly, it says, we are not going to disband until we have had major reforms in France, constitutional reforms. Which basically means they are now claiming that they have the right to write a constitution for France, and they're not going anywhere until they get one. So they've upped the ante again. Well, the king decides, he's got to have the royal session. So on June 23rd, 1789, he calls the royal session. He calls in all the estates, the aristocrats, the clergy, the commoners, puts them in a big room, and he says basically, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to just lay down the law here. This is Louis XVI telling you how it's going to be. Because I'm the king and I have the ultimate authority and you don't have any authority, so you're going to sit there and listen to what I tell you. The king presents a 35-point program of reforms. Right? A 35-point program. First of all, he says he agrees that he will not impose any new taxes without the approval of the Estates General. Well, that's a huge concession because the king used to say, I can impose new taxes whenever I want to. He's saying, no, I won't do it without the approval of the Estates General. Okay. He also says there are several really unpopular taxes, minor taxes. He says, I'll abolish those. I'll get rid of those taxes you don't like. He also says that there was a law that you could legally, arbitrarily imprison somebody. You could just put somebody in jail. You didn't have to charge them with a crime or anything. He says, I'll get rid of that. You can only be in jail if you've been charged with a crime. And then he also gets rid of corvée labor. He says, I'll get rid of the, paying taxes through labor. I'll get rid of that. That's unpopular, so I'll get rid of that. And then he finally says, I'm going to get rid of serfdom. Right? That's a big reform. And he agrees that he will let the three estates meet as a single group. Not the National Assembly. He's not recognizing a National Assembly. But he will let the three estates meet as a single group. And there's a bunch, obviously, if there's 35 points, there's a bunch of other things. But the king is making some serious concessions here. But he's not making major concessions because he makes it clear that he will not entertain anything that changes the privileges of the clergy or the aristocracy. No laws that change those privileges. In fact, he says he will insist that the clergy and the aristocracy, the first and second estates, have veto power over any law that affects privileges. So they would never give up their privileges, right? So the king then ends with this assertion that he and he alone is the source of all sovereignty and all law. There is no National Assembly. You guys are there because I asked you to come in and give me advice, but you don't have any power, right? So the king asserts royal supremacy. He says the king is the sole source of law. The king is the source of the government. You guys are nothing unless I give you some power, and I'm giving you very limited powers. Well, the king walks out of the hall, and two things happen simultaneously. First is the National Assembly, the Third Estate, and the First Estate, they refuse to leave the hall. They say, no, we're staying here in session as the National Assembly, and you can't get rid of us because you're not the boss of us. All right? And so basically they refuse to leave. And they're asserting, and by refusing to leave, they are asserting they're the ones who get to decide when they're in session, not the king. The second thing is that the king walks out of the hall and he gets handed a letter from a messenger. It's Necker's resignation letter. Now, Necker is fantastically popular with the people of Paris and with the nation. Everyone thinks he's a financial wizard. And so when Necker resigns, this would be a major blow for the king because having Necker as his chief minister is one of the reasons he's as popular as he is. Well, the guards who were supposed to clear the room realize that the National Assembly is refusing to leave the room, so they run outside and they go up to the king and they say, Your Majesty, the Third Estate doesn't want to leave the room. Should I kick him out? Right? And the Third Estate is actually saying, you're going to have to take us out at bayonet point if you want to get rid of us. Well, the guard is like, should I take out the bayonets? Right? But the king is busy reading Necker's letter, and he says to the guard, yeah, whatever, let him stay. And he doesn't realize that he just sort of gave them legitimacy when he was distracted. But everybody else hears this as, the king has agreed that the National Assembly gets to be the National Assembly. Right? So this is a major event that happens just because the king sort of misspeaks and doesn't realize what the guard is saying to him. All right. So the National Assembly refuses to disband. And finally the king says, he doesn't know what to do because he thought the royal session would be the end of it, but then he accidentally lets the National Assembly reassemble, and the next day he realizes what's going on, and he realizes he's back to the same standoff he was at before. The royal session hasn't changed anything, and so finally on June 27th he says, I'm not recognizing the National Assembly, but I'm going to allow the three estates to meet together, so I'm going to tell the aristocrats to go and meet with the clergy and the Third Estate. So he still doesn't want to recognize the National Assembly as a National Assembly. It's still the Estates General as far as he's concerned. But by letting them all meet together, he's sort of tacitly implying that this is in fact a National Assembly. So this is where the standoff is at the end of June. And the king still doesn't know what the heck he's supposed to do. Well, there's actually a faction amongst around the king at court who want to go hardline on this. They're like, you can't give them an inch. So we just got to, And basically this faction around Marie Antoinette, the queen, basically starts to work on the king and say, you've got to be hard-nosed in this, you've got to put your foot down, you've got to arrest some people, you've got to throw some people in prison, you've got to put a stop to this is dangerous. Okay? And in particular, they start blaming Necker. They start saying, well, Necker, he's really popular. As long as Necker is in power, people are going to think they can get away with stuff. You've got to get rid of Necker and put some hardline guy in there so that everybody knows they're not going to get away with stuff anymore. So this faction around Marie Antoinette wants to get rid of Necker. At the same time, they're also telling the king, the only way you're going to solve this is to assert your authority. And the best way to assert your authority is arrest all of the National Assembly. Arrest anybody who's taken part in the National Assembly. Just arrest them all. Throw them in prison. Right? Well, the king and Necker are like, you can't just arrest them all because the people of Paris is, however many miles away, a long walk away. And the people of Paris are really excited about this. And the people of Paris are getting really anxious about bread prices. The people of Paris are actually starving. It's actually blistering hot this summer. And so the people of Paris are cranky, and they're all following what's happening in the National Assembly. And so basically Necker and the king are like, well, I can't arrest the National Assembly unless I'm prepared for rioting in Paris, right? And I'm not ready for rioting in Paris. So the Queen's faction then says, hey, we'll do this. Let's bring in about 20,000 soldiers. We'll bring them into the suburbs around Paris. We'll line them up around Paris. And then when you arrest the National Assembly and get rid of Necker, then we'll have the soldiers ready to pacify Paris. We'll send the soldiers into Paris. We'll shut down any riots, and we'll restore order, and everything will be fine again. Right? Except for the fact that they'd still be in the financial crisis because the National Assembly hadn't done anything. But they decide to do that. So they start to bring in 20,000 soldiers around Paris. But the people of Paris know this. They notice when there's a couple thousand soldiers here and a couple thousand soldiers, and then 8,000 soldiers just north of Paris and 8,000 soldiers just south of Paris. They notice that, right? And so rumors start flying around Paris that they're going to come in, they're going to massacre everybody, right? And this is an interesting thing, is that rumors are actually a huge part of the French Revolution. Rumors are enormous. Because people just don't have good sources of information, and rumors are often the only source of information people have. So the rumors start circulating that all these soldiers are there to massacre people in Paris. Well, then on July 12th, the king fires Necker. The people around the queen convince the king to fire Necker. Well, when that news gets out on the 12th, the people of Paris are just like, oh my gosh, they're getting rid of Necker. They're going to bring in some hardline guy. They got the soldiers out there. This is going to be a crackdown. And so the people of Paris start to get really antsy and really nervous. And you start to see, and here's where it gets kind of interesting, because when they had the elections for the Estates General, in its late 1788, every section of Paris was broken up into sections, and each section had a little committee, an election committee that oversaw the election for that. And this was the first time anybody had ever had sort of a political organization in their neighborhood in Paris. So people start gathering at the headquarters of these sections, and they start talking about it. And they start talking excitedly about all this, and they're getting pretty angry about bread prices too, which are going up and up. And they're getting worried about the soldiers, and they're worried about Necker being fired. And they finally, some of these crowds at these sections get so worked up that they decide to take matters into their own hands. They start going to local government, there are all sorts of little barracks and things for soldiers around Paris, and they attack a couple of these, and they take a few guns. And then on the 13th of July, they take a few more guns. And then on the 14th, all hell breaks loose. The news that Necker had been fired got a lot of people angry. And the news about those soldiers out there made people think something horrible is coming. And so on the morning of July 14th, they go to an armory called the Hôtel des Invalides, which is actually mostly a hospital. But in the basement, they have a bunch of cannons and other weapons. They're not in the basement, but stored there. And they take a bunch of cannons. And in particular, a bunch of National Guard troops, actual soldiers, defect from the army. They desert from the army, and they join the crowds in taking all these guns. Then they haul those guns across town to the Bastille. Bastille is this huge fortress slash prison. It's on the eastern edge of Paris, and it's like 9 stories tall. It's got these huge stone walls, and it was basically there as a fortress to protect Paris from attacks coming from the east. But for a long time, it had been used as a prison. Well, there are only like 9 prisoners in it at this point, but the Bastille has an armory in it. It's got weapons. Well, the crowd marches to the Bastille on the morning of the early afternoon of July 14th, and they demand that first, they don't go straight to the Bastille. They go to City Hall, which is halfway between the Invalides and Bastille. They go to City Hall, and they demand that the chief magistrate side with them and open up all the armories. And he says no. It's a guy named Flesselles. And so the crowd attacks Flesselles. They actually take him, they rip him apart. They literally rip him apart. They cut off his head and they stick it on a pike, which is a long spear. And they start marching toward the Bastille with Flesselles' head on a pike. Okay? When they get to the Bastille, the commandant of the Bastille, the commander of the Bastille, says, "No, you can't come in. I'm not going to let you in." He's got about 100 soldiers. And he basically says, "No, you're not coming in." Well, there's a standoff ensues, and there's a tense negotiation and all that. But basically, the commander says no, and then the commander kind of panics, and he tells his soldiers to open fire on the crowd. He kills about 100 people. Right? The soldiers open fire, and they kill about 100 people, and the crowd just gets incensed. They're so pissed that this guy just opened fire on them, and so they bring up the cannons that they had taken from the Invalides. And they bring him up right to the front door of the Bastille, and they say, "We're going to blast the door open." And the commander's like, okay. He recognizes that the front door is not going to stand up to those cannons for more than about 5 minutes. And so he hopes to sort of defuse the situation by surrendering. But when he surrenders and opens the doors, the crowd bursts in there, and they grab the commander and all of the soldiers, and they rip them all apart. And they kill them all, and they cut off all their heads, and they stick them on pikes. And then they have an enormous parade through Paris with all these people carrying pikes, which are about 14-foot-long spears, with these heads stuck on top of the spears, bloody severed heads, and they march through Paris, and they liberate the prisoners who were in the Bastille, and they carry them around Paris on their shoulders like they're heroes or something. And basically, they take all the weapons out of the Bastille. Well, this is a real blow for the king, because if the population of Paris is armed and angry enough to kill all the soldiers in the Bastille and the mayor of Paris, or the chief magistrate of Paris, they're really angry, right? And they're now armed, and they're just over there, right? And so the king realizes he cannot arrest the National Assembly. He simply cannot. Because if he does that, they're going to have an army of armed, angry workers coming out of Paris and marching on the Versailles with blood in their eyes. And so he decides he cannot do that. And so he officially agrees that the National Assembly can stay. Right? So now the National Assembly is officially exists, if you will. It's recognized by the king. The king brings back Necker, hires Necker back, and the city of Paris, the Commune of Paris, it's called, creates a new government. The old magistrate Flesselles had been killed. He had been named by the king. Now the city of Paris creates their own government. They create a Paris Commune, and it's led by a guy named Bailly, who is actually an astronomer. And they also convince the king to organize a group called the National Guards. Okay, and this new National Guard is actually a volunteer militia. And it's made up of middle-class people, because you had to buy your own uniform, you had to buy your own gun, and the amount of money that it cost to do that, because there were strict rules about what kind of gun you could have, what kind of uniform, meant that only middle-class people were wealthy enough to actually afford this. And so the National Guard becomes this sort of middle-class military force in Paris, and it's tens of thousands strong. And by the end of the year, it's 150,000 strong, the National Guard. So this is a military force that is not necessarily loyal to the king or the aristocracy, right? Now, they claim they take an oath of allegiance to the king, but everybody knows that this is sort of a threat to the king. And the hero of the American Revolution, Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, is named as the commander of the National Guard. And so Lafayette is, he's fantastically wealthy. He's one of the wealthiest aristocrats in France, but he was famous for having fought with the French forces for the American Revolution. And he's famous, he was a member of the Committee of 30, and he's famous for being sort of liberal. He embraces Enlightenment ideas, etc. So he is seen as sort of a hero of the revolution. He's a hero of the American Revolution, and now he's the commander of the National Guard, and so he's in charge of the biggest military force that represents revolution in France. And so now the National Assembly basically says, we're going to sit down and we're going to write a constitution for France. And this means that this is really now becoming a revolution, because at the very least, the king has had his powers diminished. The National Assembly has come into existence. There's been violence, and they have a new government in Paris, and other cities around France also get rid of their city governments and create a new popular government. And now you've got the National Guard, so the sort of forces who want change have a military force, and they're going to write a new constitution. They're going to restructure the government. So the revolution is really, really here by the end of July 1789.